I do know, like, actually my mom's friend, um, who can, and he's a like professor. He does like he teaches about Japanese culture, and he actually can just like straight up can see ghosts to the point where when he was younger he couldn't differentiate if it was a ghost that was like talking with him or if it was a person until that ghost disappeared like instantaneously. And at this point he's like probably 60 something right now. He's so used to it that like he's not bothered by it at all. So like if he moves into a new apartment and there's just like a person there and he knows it's a ghost, he would just like talk to them. And I think that's just really fascinating. Like I wish I talked more to him about it, but I was kind of also scared of him because of that when I was younger. But that's just like I definitely don't shut out the supernatural, the presence of the supernatural in real life, even though I haven't really experienced that myself.
Welcome to the Netflix and Kill podcast. On this recording, I have Lilian, who runs the Breathing Film blog that is on WordPress, as well as having a Letterboxd account. So, yeah, what's up? Uh,
Hi, nice to meet you. Yeah. That's everything that is on that about me page is absolutely true. And I'm also thinking about maybe seriously studying film in graduate school as well. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if you want to go more into that, I mean, are you currently in school and what for? If you want to delve
Yeah.
into that, or if not, it's fine.
Yeah, sure. I'm currently a senior right now, and I'm not majoring in film and media. I'm only minoring in it because I kind of like discovered that field, I guess, that realm very recently, like 2 years ago. But I'm just really grateful that among the friends I've here and the organizations that are at this college, there's just a lot of opportunities to both watch a ton of films and also just talk about them in both inside and outside of class. I've been to the Telluride Film Festival and the Sundance Film Festival, and that being a part of that like atmosphere really inspired me to take film much more seriously. And in terms of my favorite genres, definitely I love horror, and I also like just specifically East Asian films, and I hope to do research on them. Yeah,
Oh, all right, fantastic. Yeah, I have some questions about film festivals and preferred genres. So,
great.
cool. All right. All right. Yeah. So I guess the first thing here is I just like to start the interviews off with this is how do you define horror? What criteria must be met for you to consider a film horror?
Okay. Well, I think that horror definitely can have many components, but for me, something that stands out and that would really, for example, differentiate your typical horror film from something that like really chills me to the bone is definitely psychological horror. And even more than that, kind of a horror that reflects on some kind of social evil or social darkness. Um, a film that comes to mind is a Japanese film called Ju-on, and it's very famous. It's a whole series, I think, directed by Takashi Shimizu, and it was also there was an American adaptation as well. The idea of having someone who basically all of society, like Japanese society, sort of bullied, is a domestic housewife who later turns into a ghost. And essentially, she is so vengeful, so furious, and so sad that she becomes an entity after she dies. That kind of thing, I think, is the most terrifying thing. Because emotions usually, like, we say sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. The idea that physical pain, you can see it, and that can be horrible. That is a kind of gore horror that other people might find terrifying, but I'm very actually desensitized to it at this point. But the words that never break me actually can actually break you. Things that you can't see with your eyes, and then that manifest into something that can come back and harm you because of something that was done to them. I think that's the most terrifying thing. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. That was an awesome answer. Yeah, usually what I get is like the tone. So it could
Mm.
be supernatural or not. Sort of like you mentioned, that psychological horror. Next thing is, why do you watch horror films? Is it catharsis? Is it to be more empathetic, nostalgia, the special effects, what have you?
Hmm. Okay, that's really interesting to reflect on. I think okay, so actually, it my love for horror, it really does go back to that Japanese film Ju-on that I was talking about. When I first started watching horror, I only watched Japanese horror. And the thing is, my dad played a really cruel trick on me when I was 11 years old. We were in a hotel, and he told me that there was a really cool Japanese documentary on the television. Um, but it was actually Ju-on. And if people people who have like watched that film, Juon is kind of there's a scene in one of the films in a series where there's like the surveillance footage and the ghost comes out of the surveillance footage. And so it does look like a documentary when you first start watching it. So I completely like let down my guard. And when the ghost came out, it actually was like extremely like traumatizing and harrowing. And I think I spent like the next maybe like 3 years or so just like casually dealing with that by trying to overcome it by watching Japanese horror. So at first it was kind of like to challenge myself on a subconscious level, I guess. I never
Yeah.
consciously told myself this I'm gonna get over this, but I just got obsessed with Japanese horror. And then it kind of became cathartic, definitely when I was stressed, like in a stressful period, especially with academics for some reason. Like, and I guess it's pretty common. The idea that like a jump scare can kind of like just make your body forget about long-term stress and stuff like that. And then now I'm more into thinking about its effects, its social effects, why people are so into horror, even though they are also simultaneously so disgusted and repelled by a lot of things that horror movies address or that they depict. I think that's really fascinating to me about both biologically, like how our psychology works,
Yeah.
and also socially, like how our society tells us what is to be repelled, what is not okay, and what is okay. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. All right. Yeah. So, um, I I guess kudos to your father, sort of in a way. It's sort of
I guess.
rude, but
Yep.
all right. So, what are your preferred horror subgenres and why?
mm, I definitely. I think I go everywhere really. I my favorite is definitely like the Japanese kind of female ghost. And I think, yeah, like the kind of typical, they also are featured on like Ringu, The Ring. And now after those two films, after Ju-on and The Ring, I think like a lot of films kind of just copy that style where there's like a girl with a white dress, like her funeral dress, I guess, and really long hair that covers her face. For some reason, that just like has always scared me a lot. In terms of other genres, um, I think there's also something about serial killer genres, like especially if it's focused on, um, I guess you could call them slashers, but more like a psychological kind of serial killer type thing, just like Silence of the Lambs. I really like that. I think that's very scary, mostly because of the reasons I've mentioned before. Just very psychologically, like you don't know how this person works or something, and they're peeling back layers of who they are on the inside. Like kind of layer by layer, and many times it shocks you either in a good way or a bad way, like in a morally like good way or a bad way. But I definitely like those films as well, and I also dabble a bit in like gore. I'm not super affected by it, but I just think it's kind of amusing. So like all the Saw series and stuff like that. But I do go all
Amusing.
over the place. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. For like, I usually just call them like psychopath films. Like if like a Silence of the Lambs or something like that. I know that's
Mhm.
sort of more procedural,
Mhm.
but like, and then like I know that term torture porn is pretty
Oh
popular, but
yeah, yeah.
I call it torture psychopaths because that's essentially that. You're kind of central thing or antagonist is a person that's torturing people.
Right, that's
I don't
definitely
know.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, so like that torture porn thing, I get it, but I'm like I think torture psychopath should be the new, kind of categories or term for it, but whatever. All right, so that's interesting. Okay. Um yeah, so in terms of criteria that must be met for you to give a horror film like a perfect score or five
Mm.
stars out of five, is it like must it be culturally significant? Must it unsettle you? Like what kind of
Hmm.
yeah, so
Yeah. Hmm. I think I can start off by talking about horror films that I feel like do not meet my criteria or kind of just fall flat. I think definitely there is this thing about horror films that a lot of people like they forgive the plot line because, and this I don't frown upon because horror films are this kind of unique genre and unique way of filmmaking so that it's not like a drama film or like a even like a suspense film. In that the plot doesn't really have to be that complicated. That it's about these moments where, in fact, the plot doesn't actually matter, where you're kind of outside of your own like rational, logical mind. Um, and so there's a lot of jump scares. There can be moments where they show like a full on visual of a gory thing and you completely forget what's going on. You're just focused on that one shot. And I think that's really mesmerizing and really great about horror films that it can bring you out of that state of like, oh, what's the character going to do next? Um, at the same time, I feel like a lot of films that I have not liked in the past they kind of take that and like run with it to the extreme. And they forget to realize again there's a psychological component. There's something that sometimes the most horrible or terrifying thing that can happen is something that happens inside of a character and not just something that a character confronts from the external world. So not just a series of jump scares and people with no character development running away from them. And I that just kind of turns me off very much so, unless it's a parody or something like that. Um, I definitely like quite a bit of character development, and I think I can distinguish that from like a very intricate plot because you can actually add nuances of character depth and character complexity with just a few scenes or a few shots. Um, Another thing that kind of, I guess, perhaps turns me off um, is too much of like jump scares and stuff like that. And again, I want to distinguish between, I don't want to simplify it because there's some films that like, I've experienced some films that have again, what you talked about, like a lot of people like horror because of a tone or an atmosphere and that atmosphere in of itself can be completely crippling like when you are in that zone with that horror film and you think you kind of your brain tricks you into thinking that you're experiencing it as well that is in your world. um, it's as if a jump scare is going to come out at any moment and that suspense is really really dense and I think that can make a horror film an amazing experience. But the idea of like actual jump scares coming out from left or right it actually starts desensitizing you after a while. So there is a difference between the constant expectation of a jump scare and having actual jump scares come out at you. Um, so I think that's another turn off for me. And then in terms of what really like makes a horror film like the creme de la crop, um, I think before any kind of cultural or social significance, it does have to scare me on a psychological level, on a level where maybe when I was watching the film, I didn't like jump or cover my eyes or anything. But when I walk out of the film for the next at least 2 days or so, like it kind of wafts back into my subconscious or my conscious. I think when I was in high school, I watched The Ring, the 1998 version, which doesn't have a lot of gore or jump scares or anything like the American adaptation. And there were in the video, like the curse video that the audience, the spectator sees with the character. There's just one shot with a man with a towel over his head pointing at God knows what direction, just pointing at something, and he's on a cliff. And that's not something that will make like little children like run away from the theater. And it's only 2 or 3 seconds. And also the video is kind of old, so it's distorted and stuff like that. So when I actually watched that, it was like, oh, it's fine. It's just they're trying to do something creepy. But the days after that, the idea of like, where would you see a man with a towel over his head pointing at some place? Like, that just does not make sense. And you kind of feel just something in your, like, is disturbing if you would see that in real life. And that image just keeps on replaying in my mind until it kind of like makes me kind of paralyzed from fear. Like, it was really hard to get over that image when I was in high school. Um, so small things like that can really make a movie. And then, so that would be like the movie is like 4.5 stars already on Letterboxd or something.
Yeah, yeah.
But what makes it like really over the edge would be that kind of, and then you take a step back and you realize, wow, it was just talking about society all along. This thing is just like a manifestation of what we've been talking about on the news, or like some things that certain groups of people experience. Like, for example, in Ju-on, if you go into a little bit of the research, which I loved going into the research for that film, talking about how even though she can affect and kill any person she wants, at least in the original film, the people have to step into her domestic territory. There's a lot of things about gender suppression there that is obviously very personal to like a female like spectator like me, and just to see that, but see that in a very physically gory or physically like I don't know scary scenario. It's just something really satisfies me about that. It feels like, oh, this will get spread to more people because people will actually viscerally feel the fear that is in many ways abstract in real life. Yeah.
All right. All right. Wow. Thank you for that. All right. All right. So I guess we're gonna not be as heavy here. Oh, actually, yeah. This question is up, and you kind of mentioned your father here, but
Mhm.
what events and/or people helped cultivate your interest in horror?
Hmm. So definitely, yeah, you're right. My dad, indirectly, and to be honest, after that, I don't know if other people watching horror experience this as much. And I'm definitely not saying this as like a sad thing, but horror watching horror films is something that is very solitary because all of my friends, like I make very like different groups of friends. So it's not like I only stick to one type of like friendship or something with one type of person. People get scared of horror films really easily. Like, they refuse to watch it with you in theaters or even when like in a lab, like on a laptop. So it's a very solitary thing. I think that having groups online and also having YouTube. When I was in middle school, like I definitely found out more about Japanese horror through YouTube, and I think there's a series about like Japanese tall tales or Japanese urban legends, and I would just watch that, and it would feed that passion. Um, the interesting thing is because usually people discover horror outside of class, and they find a group of people who are into horror outside of like academics, but I found a group of people who liked horror in a horror film class. And it's kind of sad to talk about it, but it's sort of like you realize, like, oh, these people are in the class. They obviously can withstand, like, the I guess, the shock and the terror of watching a horror film because they've, like, made a choice to sit through a class that every week we have to watch one horror film. And then it was a really great experience just going through that and watching how people kind of react to horror films when they're watching them. That was really fun. But I think for me, most of the time, like it was mostly usually how I introduce friends to horror films is just I just talk. I illustrate the most scary points to them by talking about it, and then I think that's enough of an experience for them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I mean this. It's yeah, and to get back early to when you were answering, I forgot which question, but yeah, horror is just like a unique thing, just because it is like an emotive genre. I think that's what they call it.
Yes.
Just like comedy. So again, it's not all about like what's gonna happen next, like you mentioned. And I wanted to ask too, because you mentioned you had that horror film class. Did you kind of do you feel like those who are fans of genre or fans of horror are more desensitized to those who are, I guess, against watching horror, or what's from your experience, I should say, just kind of a.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And this is where I think you're, at least for me and the friends in that class, there's two kinds of desensitization. So one is like the type that most people talk about, where like you see blood on the screen or you see some corpse or something, and you don't immediately like have the instinct to turn away anymore. I definitely feel like that's true. So in terms of physical gore, um, if I watch gore with people who are not familiar with that genre, or like even in a non-horror film where there's like a moment, a flash of gore, and people like squeal or they turn away, and I realize I'm usually like the one who's like, okay, let's move forward. That was okay. um, and so that's one type. I think the other type is also really interesting, which is, I guess, like the jump scares and the psychological horrors. I don't think we're desensitized to it. We don't when That's why we still like watching horror films, right? People who watch them for pleasure. It's because we aren't desensitized to them. That's why we keep going back, for like jump scares and all of that. But the key thing I think is that our ability to like hold that in our memory starts becoming shorter and shorter. Um, which I think is pretty cool. Like I remember when I was back in middle school, and like if I watched like a jump scare, or like if something, yeah, one of those things, not necessarily gore, like maybe a loud sound or something or a shadow that struck me, I could literally have nightmares about it for like 3 days straight. And like when I like go to the shower or something, I think about it and I get scared. But as I get older, I watch so many more horror films, and I also start seeing some of the similar tropes. So I'm like, oh, filmmaking perspective, like this is a trope. Um, then you still get scared, but then it's like 10 minutes later you forgot about it, or like it stops affecting you emotionally or something like that, and then it just becomes like, oh, that was such a cool scene, rather than something that actually really really affected you. So that I think is good for the horror film watcher, because it doesn't automatically like make you not feel the emotions you're supposed to feel when you're watching a horror film, but it kind of just makes you forget a little bit faster, in my experience.
All right, got it.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, it's for myself. I do
Hmm.
like a unsettling, right? Just because like I kind of want to make sure people are aware that I'm unsettled. Like, there's just like, yeah, I dug like Maniac with Elijah Wood. Like I enjoyed
uh
it just because of how unsettling it was. A lot of people dislike it just because how unsettled they were. But it's like, I just want to make sure, like, yeah, dude, I love that movie, but not in a way like, yeah, I like watching people. I don't know.
yeah, yeah,
So,
no, no, I totally
yeah,
understand. Yeah, like I
it's
think people, because I guess on the outside, I don't seem like too much of a horror film. Like I don't know why people have like a stereotypical like, oh, this person must like horror films, and this type of person that looks this way doesn't. But I guess I'm like, people start realizing I like horror films, and they're like, how could you? Like, you're like a morally good person, and like you're polite and stuff. But I think it's, yeah, like once they actually get to hear me explain about horror films, and why I like them and stuff like that, um, then they kind of understand, and then they start reflecting on themselves, which I think is really cool. Like, oh, like I have dark moments, or like, I definitely like getting scared, maybe by not, but not by a certain type of horror film, but by others. And that's interesting as well. Some people are completely just, they refuse to watch a certain type of horror film, and it's like just morally disgusting or something. But for other types, they're totally open to it, and it's really just based on preference, I guess.
yeah, and like for me, my thing now is like it's just to challenge me to be more empathetic, even if it's like
Mm.
characters that I don't really agree with their actions. Like I just got done watching Love by Gaspar Noah, and I
Mm.
mean the thing was those characters were very complex.
Mm, yeah,
Like
yeah.
and yeah, so but I mean yeah, just like in terms of horror, yeah, it's just anyways. I'm digressing. So, in terms of aesthetics, what are your preferred aesthetics when it comes to horror films?
Mm.
Practical effects over CGI, a hybrid of those two, monochrome over color,
Okay. Y-
and you can go into sound too. Like if you prefer like classical over synth, or I mean strings over synth, things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I think I can talk more about the visuals in a more like, I guess, like I know the terms, whereas for sound, it's just like this is loud and this is not loud. Um, but in terms of visuals, yeah, huh. I think over my, based on my experience, I do prefer practical effects. I definitely wouldn't count myself as like, I guess, like a snob in terms of like I just don't watch CGI and I don't like it. Um, I do think practical effects just does something to me, because perhaps I can then easily translate it, or I can easily reflect on my own life and I can see it play out in my own life without having to imagine too much, like with CGI. So like all the in the 1990s Japanese films that were big, like Ju-on and The Ring. I'm trying to think of American films as well. Um, I mean, like Silence of the Lambs, um, and even recently, like A Quiet Place. A Quiet Place is interesting because it's a mix of CGI and, like, I guess sound, horror through sound, so non CGI, like very practical effects. Um, and I think that kind of worked for me. A Quiet Place. What makes A Quiet Place really a really good film for me, though, is the sound more than the CGI. I feel like, especially for using CGI to create monsters, it kind of really does make it fake because most people can like distinguish, oh, this is something that a computer made. Um, and so they kind of translate that, at least for me, even subconsciously, to the fact of like, I'm not going to see that in real life. And then I would dismiss it kind of in my mind. Whereas things like sound, like for example, like any kind of horror film, they have a door creaking or something. And then as a child, you kind of, after you watch the film, you start noticing, is a door creaking around me and what can be causing that? I think that's like one of the most like magical and fascinating things about a horror film. um, and that kind of gets cut a little short by CGI. I think CGI for me really works in other genres. But I think it's interesting for a lot of horror films. Something that also does it for me is the the lack of, how do I say this? Something that really does it for me is poor footage and kind of bad sound and stuff like that, or like glitches. If you're doing like something like what's it called, the Facebook film, or like the Skype film about people killing each other over like the internet. Um, the idea of like, even when you are on a piece of high functioning technology like a computer with Skype, when glitches happen in real life, you kind of are just frustrated and you want to fix it. But then when you're in a horror movie, you immediately start thinking like, what caused that? Like, this is disturbing. Why is there something that's malfunctioning? And I think that's really cool as well. The idea that when media stops working, or when technology stops working, when you're in the atmosphere of a horror film, you start freaking out. Like, there's a whole subgenre of that. I think like the documentary film, like Paranormal Activity. I love Blair Witch, to the point where even the second Blair Witch, like the most recent remake of it, they got a lot of criticism and it was very controversial. But the idea of like video cameras, and like sometimes when they click the video camera on, it makes a loud noise. It just makes your senses really hyper. It makes you hypersensitive essentially. And I think that's really really cool in terms of the aesthetics of things. So in other films, like when it's a very typically shot film, like maybe like even Saw, everything is like, the cuts are smooth and everything. It kind of actually diminishes some of the effects, to a certain extent for me.
All right, got it, got it.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's. I feel like myself too. It's easier to suspend disbelief with practical effects. I think just
Hmm.
because it's like, oh yeah, what I'm seeing is something that's gonna be, I guess, thrown in the trash or something. I don't know. It's just maybe in the subconscious level, there's a horror aspect to that, like the amount of waste.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
But yeah, that whole suspension of disbelief is just fascinating. Like,
Yeah.
what makes a person want to be more engaged in a film, whatnot, whether it's, yeah. So
Yeah.
okay,
And I
um,
also, can I just add a little bit about sound? Because I don't know
yeah, go
like the
ahead.
technical terminologies and stuff like that, but definitely for me, and I can't believe I haven't mentioned this yet, but something that still like I will never be desensitized to is sound in horror film. Um, Friends who have seen me watch horror films like on my laptop with them, um, the first time I watch a horror film, if I have control of the sound, I will always turn it down or turn it off. And among my like horror film people who are enthusiastic about horror films, who are my friends, they're like, "Oh, you're so fake! Like, you're not enjoying the horror film properly." But it's actually because like I would be like really, really terrified if there's sound involved in my first run through of the horror film. So I want to like kind of take care of myself. And so sound is like a really, really big component for me. And I feel like that's because like I've read somewhere like sound can travel and your brain can react to sound like much faster than your brain can react to a visual. So that thing like like especially after I knew about that fact, like I just started understanding like I just get really, really like I physically react to sound, whereas I don't think I physically react to visuals. Like for jump scares, the thing that scares me is probably like the 10 seconds of suspense music, and then like the huge bang, and then I see the person. I'm like, okay, that's okay, but the build up that the sound creates, it creates that atmosphere, and then it kind of like pops you out of your comfort zone in a way that you can't expect based off of your when you're looking around and you're trying to search for things. You can't expect the sound to just pop out. So I just wanted to mention, like, that's definitely a big factor for me for what makes a good horror film.
Yeah. I mean, I got done watching because I saw you had like Ju-on and Insidious as some of your favorite horrors. I watched both, and man, Insidious with the sound, that
Yeah.
sound design, whether it's diegetic or non-diegetic,
Right,
is
right.
just like,
Yes.
it was just fantastic. It's sort of like, yeah, I don't have control of this like physical reaction to it,
Exactly. Yeah.
and I like how I think James Wan or
Mhm.
Lee Wynell, or however you pronounce the name, mentioned
Mhm.
like they wanted to make jump scares where there is payoff to it, you know. So
Mm.
yeah, in that film, it's like there was one where she sees some guy outside the window or whatever, and
Oh. Uh huh. Yeah.
like when and like the infant's room or whatever, and
Yes.
again, that's like they put like a loud bang in that,
Yeah.
and yeah, dude, like I was like freaked out by
Yeah.
it
No, that
just from the
scene.
sound.
I think I remember like that was one of the most scary scenes in terms of there was also like a they were playing with the sound of a baby monitor as
Yes,
well
yeah.
that like I guess led up to that scene. I think that was really, really interesting, the idea of these soft sounds through the baby monitor, and then she goes up the stairs and suddenly there's this huge bang. And I think the first time around I didn't even see that guy in the window because my I think like this the sound scared me so much.
Yeah,
It like
yeah.
kind of just like blinded me for 2 seconds. So I didn't even see like anything. And then the second time around I was like, oh wow, that's an added component. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yes, and I love the idea of this like contrast, whether it's done through sound or visuals. Like you mentioned, there's like that soft with the baby thing, and then they have the loud bang. It's always
Yeah, yeah.
interesting when they're always messing with the contrast of certain components. All right, and so like in podcasts, like do you like podcasts? If so, what are your favorite genre centric, or I guess even
Mhm.
like again, like there's like my favorite murder and things like that. Whether it's like true crime things, like what are some of your favorite uh, podcasts that are genre centric or true crime centric?
To be honest, I'm not. I haven't actually explored podcasts in terms of like the horror genre or the suspense genre. I tend to listen to podcasts about film in general. Um, like I think Film Comment has a podcast, and like there's a the Canon where they debate, and they have episodes actually about horror films or the debate between two horror films that are very similar to each other. And then they like there's like two or three people involved, and it's like an hour long debate. And then at the end, they choose like based on the debate and based on the votes of the listeners, which film makes it to like their informal, unofficial canon of film, like the best films.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I've actually never exposed myself to like podcasts dedicated to horror. I don't know if you have any suggestions.
Yeah, just Shockwaves for sure is another
Oh
one. It's
yeah, I've
like
heard about that.
Blumhouses. You got Rebecca McKendry. You got Ryan Turek and I already forgot the other the other two people's names. They're both like they're all like people who work in the horror
That's
industry. And
great.
then
Wow.
Switchblade Sisters is one of my new finds that I really love. It's with April Wolf. It's a Los Angeles female film critic, and
Oh.
she's just fascinating. I love to hear her talk, and she talks with like female directors or females working in the industry, and
Hmm.
they go about talking about one of the guests' favorite genre films. So it's very informative, and just I think it's all it's just like educational too, but
Right. Right.
entertaining. So that Switchblade Sisters and Shockwaves are always my
Okay.
two recommendations, and
Nice.
there's many more, but I always like to give a shout out to Switchblade Sisters. April's dope.
Nice.
And so in terms of in terms of time, do you have are we good in time?
I
I
think
know.
I think so. I do have to go in like 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Oh
Yeah.
man. All right. Yeah. Oh, I guess I can go through this in terms of film festivals. Are there ones that you're interested in going to in the future, like TIFF
Mm.
or Fantastic Fest, things like that?
Yeah, I think those two have always been in the back of my mind. I think I actually would like to go to some international ones. There's a big one in Korea, and they showed like I think one year they showed I forgot the director's name, but he's known for being just very gory and controversial. So like after hearing the fact that when it's a Busan Film Festival, yeah, the Busan Film Festival. I heard that one of his films, like half the theater, like walked out when they kind
Wow.
of couldn't take it anymore. And I was like, yes, I want to see it. I want to go there and see it. And then there's also there's a film festival in Shanghai as well. Um, but in terms of American ones, honestly, uh, oh, of course, Cannes. I do want to go to Cannes, but that's in Europe. Um, I think I would like to actually go to Telluride again, um, just because I feel like the atmosphere there was really good. It's a very good independent film scene, but it has a mix of independent films and also mainstream films, including some horror films if they make it big enough, I guess, if they get recognition outside of their own niche. Sundance for me was really, really cool as well, but it was definitely more geared towards independent films. Um, so it's kind of based on preference. Yeah.
All right. And then I guess kind of a quick answer here. I mean, have you ever had a super quote unquote supernatural experience like messing with the Ouija board, participating in a seance, or do you know anyone that you have a lot of respect for that kind of has told you any supernatural experiences?
Hmm. So
You don't have to
for
go too in deep. I know
Yeah,
with time.
yeah, 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 sure. For me, the only thing that I've probably experienced is so I have a sometimes when I dream things, I have like a weird like when like even distant relatives of mine have passed away when I was younger. I think I don't have it as often like in the past 4 years, but definitely before college. Sometimes I would like have a very lengthy dream about a relative, and the next day, like my mom would tell me that they've passed away. So like the idea of like I guess predicting the a death of someone in that sense have always it's happened probably 3 or 4 times to me. Um, and then it's happened in a very smaller scale in terms of like I think pretty often. After I take a test, I would have a dream about the test, and then the dream is like I got exactly the test score that I got on in
Wow.
my dream. So it's like really weird. Those things happen a lot, especially in middle school. But then that is like the full extent of it.
Yeah, and I guess yes, the synchronicity type of experiences are always out there, like you mentioned with the dreams, with the test scores, and then you got the exact same thing. I think
Yeah.
it's always interesting when you kind of become aware of like certain things that are kind of in sync, but they're not meant to be. Like a
Right.
certain
Right.
certain thing, lyric from a song, and like something happens in reality
Yeah.
that really it's like, wait, what? But all right,
Yes.
so thank you so much for doing this recording.
No
It's
problem.
way longer than I expected, but it was very in, educational, and
Yeah. No, this
I
was
hope,
really enjoyable. Yeah.
yeah, I hope I have you back on again. I would like to maybe go into. I always wanted to do Spectrovision's films, but that's quite a bit of films. But
Cool.
all right, thank you so much, Lilian. Everyone, check out her blog. Again, I guess you can kind of go ahead and just state the sites or where they can find you.
Yeah. So if you actually go on my Letterboxd account, my Letterboxd is Breathing Film, and the user, like the name on there, is Lilian Kong. And I think right next to my name, I have my address for my blog. So definitely follow me on Letterboxd and also check out my blog if you have time. I also work for Cinema 35. It's just a collective blog website that offers news about filmmaking and films, and also reviews on there as well. So thank you for having me, and I always enjoy your reviews on Letterboxd, and this was just a really good experience. I never talked to It's been a long time, I guess, since I've talked to people about horror films to such an extent. So it's nice.
That's the end of the interview. Thank you, Lilian. You're an awesome person to interview. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another recording of Netflix and Kill. And as always, be unsettled.